I would ask Mr. Timothy Afful Koomson to come on.
Thank you all for your presence. What I'm going to do is to share some best practices and lessons learned from how we've been working with African governments to strengthen policy, regulatory framework, and also institutional capacity for climate resilient infrastructure. And I'm going to look at why climate resilient is very important in Africa, what we've been doing, the key entry points, and then some best practices and lessons learned that I'll be sharing with you. And then I will also like to throw in what are the gains and the pains as we've been doing this, and then some key messages and way forward. Now, why is climate resilient infrastructure very important in Africa? It is very, very important because Africa is relatively lagging behind in infrastructure, but then the continent is also very highly vulnerable to a lot of climate risk, flood, extreme heat waves, frost, and actually to tell you the truth, I didn't even know that Africa is also vulnerable to frost and snow until we had a presentation from Swaziland and Lesotho. And it was very, very surprising that, oh, so we also have snow in Africa. And so and there are several climate risks that the continent is really exposed to, and which means that we have to take this as an opportunity to build it right. Although most of the infrastructure that needed to be built on the continent are not yet built, we have to take the opportunity to build it right from the go. Now, climate resilient infrastructure is actually embedded on the 10-year strategy of the African Development Bank. And the 10-year strategy focuses on enhancing climate resilient and also sustainable infrastructure. Now, we also have the high fives, which defines the bank's engagement with regional member countries. And we have the Light Up, Empower Africa, Integrate Africa, Industrialize Africa, Feed Africa, and Improve the quality of life for Africans. All these 5 key initiatives involve infrastructure. And mainstreaming climate resilient infrastructure in the policies and regulatory framework, it's something that we've been pursuing. And you also are maybe aware that we've issued green bonds for climate resilient infrastructure projects. And I'm happy to tell you that Morocco actually has about 40% of the green bond proceeds, the 500 million green bond proceeds. And one of it is the Ouarzazate, a solar project, the new one, and then also the ONI integrated wind and power project. And they involve some climate smart projects that were funded. Now, the African Development Bank has also committed $5 billion per year investment that really targets climate change-related initiatives, and that includes climate resilient infrastructure. Just to share with you our entry points for engagement in a climate resilient infrastructure. One is the physical assets. That is when we are designing the physical infrastructure. So, for example, if we are building a road and the road is in an area which is prone to flooding and inundation, we have to make sure that we incorporate some road drainage systems like culverts, side roads into the projects. And this wasn't done actually before, and you are aware that there are a lot of countries in Africa that when it rains, the roads are not usable because of flooding. And I was actually talking with friends and during the lunch, and we realized that it's not only actually in Africa, but even in the US, because a lot of the roads were built without anticipating that there will be a Harvey or Irma someday. So it's not only Africa, but just to let you know that we approach it One entry point is the physical asset. The other one is the institutional area. So how do we get the institutions and then also allied associations like engineers to understand the design for roads and other infrastructure? And then we also have risk management. Now, we are dealing with climate, and climate change has a lot of risk and uncertainty. If you are going to build a hydropower, for example, something that the bill will really identify. If you're going to build a hydropower and you are looking at maybe 1,000 megawatt, you need some level of water flow, the hydrology, to really meet that. But you cannot be sure that with the climate variability, you're going to have that. But then you could also not, because of the uncertainty, you cannot have everything crossed. So what you have to do is to maybe share some of the risk. And it could be even operational risk that could be shared. So we also encourage, if the uncertainty is too much that you cannot safeguard the vulnerability, you could also share the risk. And then we have policy and regulatory. And I think the presentation is going to focus on the two down, policy and regulation and institutional. That is the focus of our discussion today. But we've been doing a lot, particularly climate screening. And I will just share a little bit with you, but I won't go into detail because we are not going on the physical asset side. So what are some of the best practices that we've discovered in strengthening policy for climate resilient infrastructure? The African Development Bank started climate change issues in early part of 2008. And this is before even some of the multilateral banks put it on their agenda. Because climate resilience is very, very important for African countries. So the bank developed a climate change action plan. And we finished with the first phase. And we are in the second phase, which is from 2016 to 2020. What this does is that based on the action plan, we have the country programming that it's a form of engagement or a development plan with the regional member countries. And we're able to filter a lot of the objectives from the climate change action plan in their country strategy papers. And one of the lessons that we've learned is that it really facilitates mainstreaming climate change issues in medium to long-term infrastructure development plans of the regional member countries. Because without that, most of them really do not know what they have to do. And with this, we are able to hold their hands and align those measures with infrastructure development pillars of their country strategy papers. Let me tell you one thing that is very, very important, that we align climate resilient infrastructure, climate resilient measures with infrastructure. In Africa, adaptation is predominantly small-scale projects, small-scale community projects. And the average approved amount for adaptation in Africa is almost about 3 million. Now, with infrastructure, you could actually go over 50 million. For example, the cost of adaptation measures for the Batoka Gorge, it's almost about 50 million. So if you don't scale up climate change finance by focusing on infrastructure, you're going to actually have a lot of these small-scale adaptation projects. And if GCF has 50-50 balance allocation, and you have projects that's average amount of 3 million, your absorption capacity is going to be very, very, very a big challenge. So we realize that, aligning adaptation with infrastructure is the best way to scale up climate finance for adaptation on the region. And we also use it to cost and make investment planning for the incremental cost that will be associated with the infrastructure. So, other best practices for strengthening operations. The first one was policy. This one for strengthening operations for climate resilient infrastructure. In our operation, we have something that we call the climate safeguard system. And our climate safeguard system was actually developed before World Bank just developed theirs in 2015. And the climate safeguard system has been in operation since 2013. And what does that is that it facilitates upstream screening of the projects so that you're able to identify the climate risk that the project is really exposed to. One benefit of this is that it helps you not to just do an unplanned intervention, but then it gives you the concrete risk that you have to deal with for specific projects. And we undertake this through the whole project preparations cycle, from the categorization to the readiness review to the environment and social assessment. And as we are screening, we are also identifying possible investment instruments that could help to handle the incremental cost of the climate measures. And one thing that we've noticed particularly with this is that we are also able to get some information, because if you are going to pursue climate finance, you have to have the qualified project elements. So these instruments are able to provide us with the vulnerability context and then also the qualified cost that could be eligible for funding by international financing mechanism like the GCF or GEF. The third one is some best practices that we have seen in institutional capacity. And we just finished some program that we organized in the ECOWAS and the SADC region. The ECOWAS region was focusing on transport sector, and the SADC region was focusing on the energy sector. And we've realized that the expert meeting and the needs assessment help us to identify knowledge and capacity gaps. For example, you have a lot of engineers that are designing roads and designing energy and water and sanitation projects that are not really aware of climate risk. And we are designing and constructing infrastructure projects in the old traditional way. So it was opportunity to enhance knowledge of these engineers and project developers. We've also realized that it provided the opportunity to take stock of what is being done there, what are the gaps, and what could be done. And also to help us determine the opportunities, constraints, and challenges that are confronting us for integrating climate risk in infrastructure development on the continent. And we also had training, and it was a training that encompassed a lot of the institutions, relevant institutions in the SADC region. And the SADC is actually the Southern Africa Development Community. Yeah, the SADC region. There were representation from 23 countries. So the participation was really encouraging, and most of the institutions were poised to learn new things and to filter that in their infrastructure development plans, their country national plans for infrastructure. It's also an opportunity to scale the capacity to mobilize adaptation finance at scale, because now a lot of them are looking at proposals that is going to be submitted to you. Trashing. So you're going to be bracing the review of a lot of...
Can you cut the microphone?
And also help us to coordinate the project preparation. We have about 6 projects that we are helping them to seek project preparation for further development. And then, of course, institutional knowledge exchange and skills transfers. So as we've been doing this, what are some of the gains that we've realized? We've realized that it provided us the opportunity to get Africa to build the right infrastructure from the scratch. Yes, we are lagging behind infrastructure, but then we could also build the right infrastructure. And this is a great opportunity. It also helped us to safeguard investment from potential climate risk, and then also improve the scalability of adaptation finance, as I've told you. And it's also an opportunity for scaling up capacity for addressing vulnerability of infrastructure projects to climate risk in Africa. And as you are aware, we have a hydro project in Tanzania, the Interi Dam in Tanzania, that was actually built without climate resilient measures. And as we are talking now, that particular project is not functioning. It's not operating because there is no water. The penstock were so high that the level of flow, they cannot even operate. And if you go for financing to implement such a project, and you have to use the cash flow from the tariff or the revenues to really service the debt, that is a problem. So what are some of the pains? We've realized that the incremental cost of climate resilient measures is about 10%. And 10% of 1 million is nothing, but 10% of 100 million, 200 million, 2 billion infrastructure is a lot. Sourcing concessional funding is also one of the challenges. And we are grateful that GCF is now operational. And we look forward to the fund mobilizing a lot of concessional resources that we could use to advance climate resilient infrastructure on the continent. Then also project projections. There are always uncertainty and risk, and then also avoided expected cost. The other issue is the availability and reliability of climate data for determining these climate risks. So in a nutshell, what I want to leave with you is that the opportunity to integrate climate risk measures in infrastructure will help us to build it right, build the infrastructure right from the beginning. It also provides us the opportunity to climate-proof infrastructure projects that are critical to reduce infrastructure investment risk, also climate-related health and fatalities. And we all remember what happened in Malawi and Mozambique when the rain came. There were a lot of fatalities, there were a lot of sicknesses. And then also, the bank, the African Development Bank, has taken an initiative consistent with its 10-year strategy and has developed the tools, procedures, and the systems to help screen and to help provide adaptation measures. He has also forged partnerships. You heard about AfriRest. African Development Bank is part of that initiative with the World Bank. And then also with enhanced capacity and facilitated investment for climate resilient infrastructure in Africa. We are actually having a phase 2 of the climate resilient infrastructure initiative, and Morocco is one of the countries. We are focusing now, the first initiative focused on the ECOWAS region and the SADC region. The second phase is going to focus on the Eastern Africa region the Northern Africa and the Central Africa. And because Morocco is a Francophone, the Central Africa will be joining the Francophones in the North. That is Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria. And we are going to have those trainings over here. So this is just to share with you some lessons that we've learned and some best practices for strengthening policy, institutional capacity, and then also operations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Timothy. I think it's very, I'm very proud to say that the African Development Bank is having like is playing a leadership role in pushing the climate change resilience agenda in Africa and supporting African countries in moving forward towards the climate resilient projects. Very quick comments. I think what you mentioned is one of the core elements that we're trying to achieve is change the mindset of the planners back home, not the people sitting in this room or people who are doing climate change, but the people who are planning and the engineers and others, because they are the ones who try to do the business as usual thing that they have. And with more and more push from the financial institutions on changing the standards, it really makes the difference because it becomes a norm instead of the old norm. On what you mentioned on the issue of adaptation in small scale in Africa, this is very true. I think many of the board members from Africa, especially in the GCF, has pushed for the programmatic approach for countries. So to have a bundle of projects rather than this 3 million. GCF was not done for a 3 million adaptation fund, maybe goes up to 5 and 6, but GCF should not be going in this small scale projects. Finally, I think what you have mentioned on this climate safeguard system should be, I mean, there should be a way to reflect that in the building and civil works codes in the countries. In my country, in Egypt, we did change the building codes only when we had an earthquake in 1992, where it was 6. We never had earthquakes before, so the building codes were only looking at the impacts of wind on high-rise buildings. Once we had the earthquake and there was a lot of fatalities, then people started changing. But we shouldn't be waiting for climate change impacts to change. I mean, I think many of the institutions and much of our work here should be pushing or finding its way into the decision makers and planners and engineers to start working on changing the codes.